You're listening to Design Between the Lines, the only design and home furnishings podcast where we talk with the movers and shakers, industry innovators, and lifetime legends of the home furnishings industry. It's here that I get a chance to sit and chat with the influencers shaping the industry into what it is today, and to learn a little bit more about life in their world. Furniture design veteran Steve Hodges of Steve Hodges Associates is known for his traditionally styled solid wood designs. A graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University and Kendall School of Design, he has served as a freelance designer for over 40 years, compiling a rich portfolio of designs from bedroom to occasional furniture in all styles and price points. Steve has received numerous accolades for his work throughout his career and frequently writes and speaks on the subject of furniture design. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'd like to kind of, as I always do in these broadcasts, throw back to the yesteryears of your life and kind of ask you about what, as you were growing up, drew you into the furniture industry, just made you decide this is the path I'm going to take, even before you got maybe into the hard design part of it.
Well, I grew up in a family that was associated with the industry. My father and my two brothers. My father was vice president of manufacturing for Link Taylor and Young Hinkle, two companies that later became part of Lexington Home Brands. My older brother, Jerry, was in manufacturing. He was at Young Hinkle, then Henderson, and later Council Craftsman. And then my brother Mike, my middle brother, he was the head of color and design for first Guardsman, then Lilly, then Valspar. And my father came from a large family. He had 5 brothers, all of whom at one time worked in the furniture industry. They worked for Bald Knob Furniture in Rocky Mount, which you know. And even his sisters married into the industry. My Uncle John Peter was the finishing foreman for Stanley Furniture for over 40 years. So I grew up in it. My dad, he brought his work home. He had a drafting table in his study downstairs. And there were always pencils around, which I stole. And I grew up drawing. I was a nerdy kid. Actually, what I wanted to be was a comic book artist. And I did not want to go into the furniture industry, but I worked summers even before I was of legal age, first at menial jobs, but then I started to work with the designers that the companies employed. What we would do, we would take the designer's detail drawing, and we would do an engineering drawing where we would add the screws, the tenons, that sort of thing. So I was doing that in high school, but I resisted getting into the furniture industry. Both my brothers went to NC State. I applied, I was accepted, and at the last minute I did an end run on my dad and said, I want to study art. And I ended up at Virginia Commonwealth studying painting and printmaking.
Was that part of the influence of your thinking about maybe going into the comic book art end of things when you talked about that earlier?
No, not really. I just it just seemed like the way to go. Although there was a very well-known Virginia Commonwealth alumnus who went into comics, Mike Kaluta. He drew Batman and the Shadow during the 70s, and that actually got me thinking about it. But in the end, by my junior year, I realized that I was never going to make a living as a painter. And to my dad's everlasting credit, I said, I want to drop out of school and go to Kendall and study furniture design. My dad said, no, stay in school, get your degree, and when you get through, if you're still interested, I'll put you through school, which he did. And thanks to my art training, I was only at Kendall a year and a half.
So you applied a lot of the things you learned at VCU in your next college career at Kendall. Did some of that come in handy when you were at Kendall? I know it shortened your time there.
Well, it's interesting. I almost had a double major in art history. And what that gave me was I was able to connect the how and the why of styles. I mean, for example, if you know anything about Jacques-Louis David, for example, the Empire style, I mean, then you can equate that with that style of furniture, why it happened. So it was very useful in that sense. And but the interesting thing is, even though I had a major in painting and printmaking, I'd never done a watercolor in my life until I got to Kendall.
Really?
Really.
Wow, that totally surprises me. I would have never thought of that. So let me ask you then, when you were at Kendall, and this may apply to VCU as well, What would you say would be the most important things that Kendall taught you when you were there?
Chiefly rendering, because if you had asked me to paint a chest of drawers, I could have done it easily. But to render it in pencil or in watercolor or markers, as it came to be, I didn't know how to do it at first. And that was the chief thing. I mean, I knew how to detail already. I knew the fundamentals. I probably knew manufacturing better than my instructors because working in a plant. But that was the chief thing. I mean, and even when I was at Kendall, I took figure drawing classes until I got into an argument with one of the instructors and quit.
Oh, good. I'm glad to know there was no anxious moments when you were in your college career. Let me ask you then, were there mentors along the way?
Oh, of course.
Besides, I'm guessing your father was.
Oh, of course. My father was very supportive. I mean, he never pushed me into the profession, but I always knew he wanted me to do that because he always looked up to the designers that worked for Link Taylor and Young Hinkle. And so the obvious mentors were Marie and Russ Kirkpatrick, who were, and this is the thing, a lot of people, even within our industry, don't know these names, but Marie and Russ, they designed the Lillian Russell for Davis Cabinet, still the longest running production suit in American furniture history.
A remarkable
Yeah,
history.
They did Tudor Manor for Globe. Russ did the original Lazy Boy chairs. They were about the coolest people I had ever met when I was a kid. In fact, they were having dinner with us when my oldest brother Jerry, and his soon-to-become wife, eloped to South Carolina.
Oh.
And Marie and Russ were having dinner with myself and my parents. Mm-hmm. But they were really, really cool people. And Marie had she had a style of sketching that I shamelessly copied for the longest time. She drew everything in perspective. Mm-hmm. And she had this system where you could scale off of it. And it took me a while how to figure out how to do it, but I eventually did. But she was just an amazing person. Russ died when I was actually in Kendall. I think that would have been 72, something like that. And I think Marie died in her 90s. My wife and I went to see her just before she died and had just a wonderful conversation with her. And she gave me all of these sketches, including the originals for the Lillian Russell.
I remember you told me about that, and those are remarkable to have the original,
yeah.
Their original. That's remarkable.
Yeah, the other designer and that worked for my dad's company was Carl Egerbrecht, another mm-hmm. person that many people don't know about. But Carl, he I don't know why he took a liking to me because he was such a stern man, almost humorless. He was very difficult to get to know, but he really took a shine to me. Carl did probably the best-selling youth group in the history of this industry, Ship Ahoy. And I can tell you when I was in college at Young Hinkle, we made that one particular group 9 months out of the year.
Wow.
We only made one other group. And I'm talking about in the days, in $1970, when we were talking about $60,000 worth of cabinet room production a day. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of money. Carl also designed Windjammer, which was featured in the movie E.T. I actually helped him on that group. Yeah, it was he gave me jobs when I started freelancing and I needed the money, so I helped him on that. I incidentally only saw the movie until about a year ago.
Oh, wow. So you're waiting the entire length of the movie to find where your product was placed.
Yes.
Very good.
Yes.
And you found it.
Yes.
Good. Well, now we're talking about you getting jobs from people who are helping mentor you and move you ahead in your career. Then let me ask you, at what point did you, what was your first job, and when did you kind of say to yourself, I found my style, I found what's me? Those may be 2 points in your career that are far apart. I don't know, but I thought I'd ask you.
That's a tough question. When I got out of school, I went to work for a freelance designer named Chuck Kane. And Chuck was a journeyman designer. I don't mean that in a disparaging way in any means. I just mean that he was the ultimate company designer. Back in the days when furniture companies had staff designers, Chuck was the head of design for. He was at Henderson. He was at American of Martinsville several times. And after I had worked with him for 2.5 months, he left to go to Stanley to be the head of design there. He asked me to go with him, but being young and being cocky, I thought, what the heck? And I took over his office and was determined to go freelance. The first big break I got, and I'm deviating from your question somewhat here, was with Burlington Furniture, which was based where I grew up, Lexington, North Carolina. And there was a gentleman there. He had married into the Philpott family, Harry Anderson. Harry later became the mayor of Lexington and was tragically killed in a lightning accident, a camping trip he was on. But Harry gave me my first big break.
Wow.
I went to see Harry during market, October of 1975. And he said, yeah, he talked to me. And he really bucked up my confidence by saying, I'm talking to you not because I know you. He was my coach in Little League football. But he said, but I think you can help us. And you've got to understand at the time, Burlington and Dixie, as we called Lexington at the time, were big competitors. They were literally right across the railroad tracks from one another. Burlington was getting into the youth market in a big way, which had before had been sort of Dixie's province. And I went in to see Harry, and in those days you went around. I mean, you really literally peddled dresser sketches.
Go around to the companies, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I went in to see Harry, and I didn't have anything that he liked. But he said, do you know anybody that does upholstery? And I lied. And I said, yeah, I do.
Of course.
And he said, do you have any sketches? So I pulled out sketches that I'd done at Kendall. Again, I learned how to render at Kendall.
Yeah.
And he said, these are great. I got back to my office in Martinsville. Harry was on the phone. He said, we'd like you to do an upholstery group for Globe. And I'm going, great. And he said, we want you to match some tables that Pete Witteveen had designed. And it was country French with all this carving. And I'm going, oh, God.
Obviously not in the phone call, but after you hung up, you went, oh.
Yeah. So anyway, I met with Pete, I think, and I saw what he'd done, and I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I went through every book I could find to try to figure out, because I think I'd only detailed one or two pieces of upholstery in school. But I pulled it off. I was so scared when I went to talk to their head of product development at Globe, Tom Patchett. He said, okay, we're going to giving you the job. And he's walking out of the room. And I said, by the way, how do I get paid? And he says, we pay 1%. And I didn't realize at the time that was ridiculously low. And I said, okay, the first check I got was for $3.85. I still have a copy of the check. But I want to return to Harry. Right after that, the following market, I went to talk to him. Mm-hmm. And in those days, you did a mock-up.
Right.
If you did a mock-up, they approved it. You went ahead with the other sketches. Well, I did one, and Harry gave me the go-ahead. So I went back to Martinsville. I spent all weekend, and this was going to be more than just a youth group. It was like a master bedroom, youth. Well, I guess that was all it was at the time, but I mean, it was still a pretty big group, especially for a kid right out of college.
Right.
So I worked on it. I showed up at his office on Monday morning, came in. He said, I've got bad news. He said, Alvin Philpott, who was the president, he says, we can't bring out another group. And I said, Harry, I spent all weekend working on these. He looked at a couple of them. He got up and he went in and he talked to Alvin. He came back. He said, we're doing the group.
Wow.
I'll never forget that.
That is amazing. So that being your first, we'll call it your big break, I think you've mentioned it, and another mentor along your way, which was a very special one that helped you along the way. Let me ask you about, you said, I think there was a question you mentioned that right away you said, how do I get paid? Right. How about when do I get paid? Did that ever occur to you, like, how does this work? Do they ship? How do I
oh yeah,
the process?
I mean, absolutely. Nobody tells you this in design school. In fact, if I were to give some advice to students today, I would say you need to take a business course because nobody tells you about any of this thing. And I just had to find out on my own. And you've got to remember, too, at the time that I started in the business, royalties were just becoming the norm. I mentioned Russ and Marie Kirkpatrick and Carl Allegra. They both worked on either retainers, or as my dad told me back in the day, you got paid for a sketch and a detail, a lump sum. You didn't, or, excuse me, a set sum. You didn't get paid on a royalty. So it was almost unheard of. You can imagine if they had gotten, say, royalties on the Lillian Russell, how much money they would have made over the years.
Yeah.
But nobody told you that. And when I got into the business, it was pretty much set. I mean, you still had companies like Bassett that had, in American and Martinsville, that had staff designers. Mm-hmm. But by and large, it was shifting toward freelance designers, and more companies were becoming comfortable with paying royalties, including companies like Bassett,
right.
Who I actually worked for through their National Mount Airy division. And Bassett was notorious for not wanting to sign a contract, but they paid you, and they paid you on time, and I never had a problem with it.
A few minutes ago, when we were off the air taking a break, you mentioned a story about Carl Egerbrat.
Yeah.
Can you reflect on that for me?
Yeah, Carl, which was a huge favor and also another big break for me. His biggest account was Webb Furniture in Galax, Virginia, and he managed to get me in there. They were paying me a retainer against royalties, against future royalties. It was not my cup of tea because I didn't like doing that style of furniture at all. But Carl, Webb wanted to celebrate Carl's 50-year tenure as designer for them, and they had a big party over in Greensboro for him during one market. And he graciously invited me. Well, when I went over there, after the dinner, Carl wanted me to come to his room, and he had a copy of Furniture Today, and there was a story about a company starting up again called Jamestown Stirling in Jamestown, New York. And he said, you need to go talk to these guys. I think it would be right up your alley. Well, I didn't know it at the time, but Mike Dugan was the president of this startup company. It was owned by Wall Street financier and skinflint Webb Turner. And I tried to make contact with Dugan and got nowhere. I didn't know this, but Chuck Kane, who I worked for, actually did the original Jamestown Stirling line. And some years later, Mike left to go to be the president of Henderson. And there was a guy that took his place named Ed Fritz. I did everything in my power. I called, I left messages, I faxed, I sent letters. The guy wouldn't return my phone calls. Then one day out of the clear blue, he calls me, and he says, I'd like to talk to you about designing Jamestown Stirling. And as it turns out, Rick Schroeder, our former ASFD president, he had turned it down. Rick had picked up, what was the division of Ethan Allen? Kling? He had picked that up at the time. He had just gone freelance, and he recommended me for the job. So I went and I talked with Ed, and it was funny because I'd actually interviewed with Dugan at one time when Chuck left. I talked to Dugan 3 times, each time leaving thinking that I had the job. I even brought sketches. He didn't ask me, but I brought sketches. And he asked me a question, and I think this is probably what soured the deal for me. I was doing some work for Pennsylvania House at the time, and he said, you know you're going to have to give that up. And I said, well, I understand that, but I'm in the middle of doing 2 groups for them. I mean, I feel obligated to proceed since they're paying me. And for whatever reason, I don't know that he liked my answer, and he hired Tom Hassett. So when Mike left, Ed, for whatever reason, didn't get along with Hassett, and he contacted Rick, and I got the job. But what was interesting, when I went to talk to Ed at his home over in Greensboro, we talked about everything but furniture. I walked in, he had a photograph on his wall of the Toronto skyline, and I said, you familiar with Toronto? And he said, yeah, he was the head of Universal Canada. And I said, well, I spent a lot of time in Toronto. I had a couple of accounts up there. We talked about Macintosh computers. We talked about everything under the sun. We didn't talk about furniture. He kept calling me back. And then finally, I think on the 3rd try, he had a rep there he wanted me to meet. And he said, okay, I want to hire you. And he said, I want you to go up to the plant. He said, now you can get a really good fare on Piedmont if you do this. And I said, what are you talking about? I'm not paying for the airfare. And that was my first introduction to Ed Fritz and his...
Ed is good. Ed was good.
He was great.
He was using his Duke graduate education very well at that time.
I learned a lot from Ed. I would consider him a mentor and a friend. Due to the fact that Jamestown had such limited resources, I got thrust into a lot of roles many designers don't have. For example, I was writing press releases for them. I wrote catalog copy. They often didn't have money for photography, so I had to do color renderings that the reps sold from. I designed the showroom one time. I mean, I designed logos. I mean, I got thrust into that.
That's one of my thoughts. My question was going to be, what have you learned by working for yourself? And I can see already you've learned to wear many hats in many cases.
Well, that's what made it fun to me. I mean, some of the best projects that I ever worked on had really nothing. Well, had very little to do with furniture design. They had more to do with romancing the product. And that's very important. I mean, for example, the very first assignment Ed gave me at Jamestown Stirling, he talked my ear off about Victorian styles. I know what he wanted. He wanted me to knock off National Mount Airy's Louis Philippe. But he had to have some kind of impetus behind it, which I thought was interesting. I wasn't comfortable doing a knockoff. So I went and I did some research, and I found a very interesting Louis Philippe style dresser that was made in New Orleans during the 1800s, which would have been the Victorian period. Yeah. And it was different in that it didn't have the key and shield hardware. It had Hepplewhite hardware.
Oh.
And it had this molding around the outside, which is not often typical of Louis Philippe. So I just basically built a group off of that, and I tried to incorporate Victorian elements that Ed was interested in. And, we went with that. But as I said, that was the start of where I got really interested in offering the total package, if you will, to clients in an attempt to get my foot deeper into the door to become more important to them. Because let's face it, in the great scheme of things, most furniture companies aren't that large. And they don't really have the resources to rely, say, on an advertising agency or something like that. And it made me more important to my clients.
Well said. Well said. That brings me to another question I've been meaning to ask you, and I think we got to a juncture here that might help a little bit. Being that you've worn a lot of hats in your career, and what you did with Ed and your partnership with him and so forth, developed, I imagine, a process to your design work. Is there something that you can talk about in your process to help people that may be interested in design and may be thinking about a design career that might want to hear how your process worked?
Well, I go back to what I just said about the Louis Philippe at Jamestown. I like to do research on it. And Ed had an expression that I always liked where he said, you have to put on your glasses and see what's going on in the culture. And I think that's very important in the design process because it depends. I mean, some clients will come to you with an idea, others will expect you to come to them. But I think you have to know what's going on in the culture. Ed was tapping into that with a little bit of that Victorian thing. But I mean, let's take, for example, why did Shaker? I remember when I was in design school, everybody loved Shaker furniture because it was so clean and contemporary. But nobody was doing a commercial Shaker group. Why did that happen? I think all of a sudden you had a bunch of baby boomers who got out and they got tired of looking at their mom and dad's 18th century formal English. They wanted something clean that was pure. They bought into the philosophy of it. And if you recall, around 1978, there was a huge exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum on Shaker.
Yes.
Not only furniture, but decorative arts. And I think that all contributed to it. And we did another group that was very successful at Jamestown Stirling. And I remember talking to Ed about it. It was a Shaker group. Why should we do one? And we talked about the philosophy of it. But what could we do that would make it different? There were maybe one or two Shaker groups on the market at the time, but they weren't all that successful. We thought, well, we could do a dovetailed base. We could do a lot of drawers. Jamestown made drawers pretty inexpensively. We could bring things to it that nobody else was doing. And one of the key signature pieces was it was a tall chest of drawers that we didn't fake the drawers. The drawers weren't dummy cut. I mean, it literally had, I don't recall, but I want to say it had about 15, 16 drawers in it. They were real functioning drawers. it was fun to get into that and do the research and get behind it in the philosophy. I mean, it's got to be real. I mean, that's so important to me. I'll give you another case in point. This was not a success by any shape or form.
Yeah, we all have successes and failures in our career, so this
I would dub a glorious failure.
Okay.
But there was a company in New Brunswick. There were two brothers-in-law that I met. And I met them in Boston, and they told me that they made Loyalist furniture.
Loyalist, okay.
And I was going, okay, I think I know what you mean, but I'm looking at what you're doing, and no, it's not Loyalist furniture. It's not anywhere. The one brother-in-law, he was a famous hockey player, and he's the guy that made the furniture, and his counterpart was a real estate developer in New Brunswick who had the money. And they wanted to start a furniture company. And I said, okay, well, if you want to do this, let's do some real, honest-to-God Canadian reproductions, but scale them for today's market. Mm-hmm. So this was a lot of fun. They had a name. They called it Saw Creek. I liked the name, but I didn't like their logo. We actually worked with them on the logo. And what I proposed to them was doing a J. Peterman-style approach of marketing, that we would literally do a catalog with color renderings, our color renderings, of the pieces in there, and we'd have this romance about it. And I remember when they finally hooked up with the sales force, these people were going, nobody's going to buy furniture over the internet. And I'm going, are you crazy? I'm buying computers. Well, you're the exception to the rule. I said, you've got to be crazy. Yeah. But we had this wonderful story, and they put together this great catalog, and then the brothers-in-law had a falling out, a fight, and they haven't spoken since.
Oh, wow. I haven't spoken since. That's a few years. So I
got a couple of royalty checks, but I think all in all, I probably netted about $5,000 out of the whole deal. But I wouldn't trade the experience for anything in the world.
No, and the priceless phrase you just said was, "Are you crazy? You're going to sell furniture over the internet?"
Yeah,
I'll never forget that.
Yeah.
Wonderful story. Culture glasses. Let's talk about Ed Fritz's phrase, culture glasses. You're going to put your cultural glasses on. I'm thinking of a phrase, keeping your designs relevant. That's relevancy is a big thing these days. I'm guessing that's how you keep your designs relevant. You're going to put on your culture glasses, see what's going on in the world around before putting pencil to paper.
Sure.
You've had a long and successful career. I think you've won a couple of Pinnacle Awards.
3.
Yeah, and it was the first one, I think, was in 1997.
Yeah, that was for Durham.
Yeah, and the most recent one, which was a hilarious moment,
yes,
was in 2015 for a youth group.
Yes,
which was a lot of fun to see, and happy for you that you've been recognized over the years. But I want to go back to a moment in time in 1981, around in there, where the American Society of Furniture Designers was founded. And I believe you were part of those meetings back then.
Yes. The initial meeting was called by Max Stout, and he had Doug Kerr, who had been a lobbyist, I believe, for the AFMA. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We met at the Furniture Library. Max, on his own initiative, had sent letters out to a number of designers in the High Point area, myself included, and I can't recall how many showed up for the initial meeting, but we all met Doug, and Max talked about his vision of what he wanted. There had been an organization of designers in High Point in the 50s, but it was my understanding that it was more of a social thing. Mm-hmm. And Max really wanted it to be a credential of professionalism, was the way I think he worded it. So we met at the Furniture Library, decided to proceed, and then Doug organized a larger meeting that was held at Top of the Mart the following market, and was there we agreed to proceed. And I mean, we had it was a real host of luminaries. I mean, Milo Boffman, Nick Ungaro, Dave Warren. I can't tell you all the. If you look at the initial meeting, who was on the initial board of directors, it's a who's who of who served in this industry, and somehow or another here. I was 6 years into the industry, something like that, and one board member who will remain nameless dropped off, and somehow or another I got picked to be on the board. And I was also the editor of the ASFD newsletter, the initial newsletter. And so I got involved with ASFD in that way, and I got to know a lot of people. It was also an interesting period in my career, too, because Dick Chapin, who was ASFD's second president, Dick, Max, and Bob Stannard, who's in New Jersey, we formed a company called the Design Group. We thought that 4 heads could be better than one. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, but we had some interesting work over the years, and it was fun to work alongside people that had different styles and interests. So anyway, that's how I got involved with ASFD.
Well, speaking of that, and the guys that you've rubbed shoulders with over the years in this business, and by the way, all of your great work on the newsletter can be seen digitally now.
Yes.
In an archive on ncdigital.com and also on the ASFD website. But I wanted to, after my shameless plug there, also talk about current trends in the industry. Do you see anything coming out that surprises you over the last couple of years that you never? I mean, obviously there's been this big push to mid-century modern.
That's questionable in my opinion. I mean, I think it's only really worked in casual dining. I mean, I've tried it myself, and it just doesn't seem to be flying much in bedroom. I mean, I love it personally, but it just doesn't seem to be flying anywhere other than casual dining. I saw in Furniture Today that Target is coming out with a mid-century modern group. Good luck to them, because as I say, the scale of it is such that I don't think it's really appropriate for today's bedroom. Again, I love it, but I don't see it. The other thing is everyone seems to be doing a lemming-like rush to try to copy restoration hardware and this so-called industrial look, reclaimed wood and that sort of thing.
Do you see anything that's missing out there right now? I mean, in their rush to do these other things, is there something maybe they're missing?
Well, I think there's always going to be room for really good, clean contemporary. And that's still a very viable category in my opinion. Traditional has taken on another role. It's gotten very casual. I don't really see anything out there that's as stunning as say like a Henderson Scene 1 or something like that we used to see. I'm dating myself, obviously, but as I said, right now, because of the internet, everybody is looking at one another a lot more than we used to do, and if that's possible.
Yeah, exactly. That, and I agree with you. I see formal dining kind of fading away.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Well, I mean, take bedroom, for example. I mean, you don't see people selling a lot of mirrors over dressers anymore because people are putting televisions over them. Yeah,
you're right.
I mean, nobody does a deck to a buffet anymore.
Doff the hat back to the cultural glasses.
Exactly.
This is what's happening in the culture.
Exactly.
They've got to reflect it. Let me ask you. Currently, I understand you're working on is it a maker directory or directory of American makers?
Yes, I was hired as a consultant for a retailer 3 or 4 years ago, who wanted to source made in America furniture, and this particular retailer was utilizing some Amish sources that were small as 1 or 2 people. So using that same criteria, I have been putting together a directory of domestic furniture makers. And again, it might be a one-man shop. It could be a full-fledged furniture company. One of the things that's interesting about it is what I've come across is that you're seeing a lot of people who had no furniture experience whatsoever. There's a company, for example, down in Wake Forest, North Carolina. I believe he was an English major, and I believe the wife was a web designer. And they are making farmhouse tables out of reclaimed lumber and giving a portion of their profits to charity. So you're seeing a lot of reclaimed wood coming from barns or historic structures, that sort of thing. You're seeing a lot of that, but more than that, there are more than you think are out there. And I'm not talking about people that necessarily just have a website. I mean, there are a lot of people that may have just a Facebook page.
Yeah.
But they're out there and they're making furniture. My opinion is it's never going to be as big as it once was, and that's probably a good thing because you won't have 18 vice presidents. And it's more like guerrilla. guerrilla marketing.
Guerrilla marketing, yeah.
Yeah, and they're making some interesting products. The other interesting thing is, too, they're rattling the chains of conventional retail channels because they don't know what a wholesale price is.
Yeah.
They're selling it for what it is.